Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Today, we're anticipating that we're going to make history with more than 100 people joining us from all over the world. That's going to be a record attendance, so wow, just thank you very much for that. Our coffee clubs are interactive, and you're invited to jump in at any time on the chat or put your hand up and share your questions, comments, and opinions. The session is being recorded for CPD accreditation, meaning that each of you will receive a prestigious CPD certificate demonstrating your personal time investing in being here today. The recording will only be available to Callisto members, and you are very welcome to join what will soon be the world's largest credit community. For more information, please contact us or follow us on LinkedIn. So, grab your mugs and get ready for a voyage of discovery as exhilarating as a triple shot espresso. Today, your barista Brad Morris and I are diving into the caffeinated world of credit risk and Altman Z-Scores. It's a blend even of financial wizardry and aromatic insights that'll leave you buzzing with knowledge. So let's stir things up and percolate our minds with a perfect blend of risk assessment and a hint of credit caffeine. Barista Brad, it's over to you, sir.
Thank you very much indeed. So let me just get things going here. Just share my screen. Everything okay on the techniques there?
Perfect. Over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, everybody, for joining. Really appreciate it. So we're going to go through the Altman Z-Score, which would have to be described as the grandfather of credit scoring and credit scoring assessment. It was designed in 1968 by Professor Altman there. You can see him. Yes, he either does look like your grandfather or your year 10 chemistry teacher. It was developed in 1968, and I want you to appreciate the context of which that was. This was the US, it was post-World War II. There was a manufacturing boom in the country, and it was developed with the idea, with the background of companies like Union Carbide, General Electric, 3M, DuPont, Ford Motors, and so forth. That was its backdrop. It's a score that represents a numerical representation of the financial risk of a company based on key ratios. It was revised in 1983 to keep up with the boom in private manufacturing in the US, as well as the increase in service-based industries. So, as I mentioned earlier, the output is a numerical representation or a score of the credit risk of the company. It operates as an algorithm. We'll go through that just quickly in a minute. And there is a considerable amount of academic research sitting behind this that would validate that this particular algorithm is anywhere between 70 to 85% effective in predicting a company falling into financial distress. So you can see there's two things there. I'll start with the blue, and those are the elements which will be expressed in ratios of the company. Those are the elements that it's going to inquire about. The green part, those are the coefficients of the model. All of those are added together in a formula to get a final risk score, which is a measurement of risk. Now, as I said earlier, this was developed back in 1968 with the idea of public manufacturing in place. And it had a sample size of about 66 companies. They were roughly between 1 and 25 million in terms of the size of the business. That in today's money is roughly about companies with a balance sheet of between 10 and 250 million. And it was expanded in 1983 to keep up with the ongoing development in private manufacturing as well as service companies. Now, with everything that's going on today, there is no end of credit agencies and consultants that can give you a credit score. However, this is still a very effective tool in credit risk screening, and it's widely used in a lot of the emerging markets. And I'm talking India, Southeast Asia, Latin America. And a few reasons for this. What I understand is the data is either not reliably collected, or there is not a statistically significant sample size to make their own models. This serves as a benchmark. Also, for the geeks out there, there's a significant amount of academic research. So you can go ahead and look at that. But more importantly, and Mark and I were discussing this at length, for the student of financial analysis, for the student who wants to increase their credit skills, if you can get underneath the skin of the Altman score and see how it works and see how it looks on the key elements within a financial statement, this will give you a wonderful set of skills to be able to assess company risk. So, yes, still very relevant in today's market. Let's just work through how it works. You take your balance sheet and your income statement, your standard set of accounts, and you take elements from the balance sheet and the income statement. These become ratios, and there are weightings added to these ratios, little multipliers, if you like, that give individual score elements to each of those, individual scores to each of those elements. These represent probably the most influential elements of a financial profile of a business. Now, I know that every credit person has got probably their own little go-to ratios, but these ones, after looking at credit and risk for over 20 years, I've got to say, looking at these, if you understand these elements of a company, you're going to be able to make a good risk determinant. And it has a holistic view. Let's just take a doctor, for example. When you go for your annual checkup, which you should, the doctor just doesn't, let's say, take your pulse and say you're okay. He's going to be doing a lot more of that. He's going to be checking your blood pressure, your respiratory system. He's going to be looking at your skin. He might even do some blood work to test for sugars and platelets and iron content. He doesn't just look at one thing. And the reason I say that is because you might hear something like, well, the company's profitable. What's the problem? I know enough people within credit that deal with administration and insolvency practice, and they deal with a lot of very profitable companies that go bankrupt. So this gives us a holistic view of what's going on with a company. All of those elements are added together. These combine to get a final score. That score then becomes a map to risk. It gives you an idea of what that score is. Now, I'm going to break down two things. First of all, what those elements are, and then how they operate in, let's say, in the algorithm. So, as I said earlier, I've been in credit risk for 20 years. And if you can understand these elements, if you can have a view on these parts of the financial profile of a company, you're going to be in really good shape to see what's going on. Now, I know with all PowerPoint decks, you're trying to read it and listen to the presenter. Read it if you like, but I'll just give you the short version of what's going on. First of all, liquidity. This is how much money's in the piggy bank today. How effective is the company from converting its short-term assets, converting its inventory and collecting money off its customers versus how much it's got to pay out in the short term? Effectively, how good is this company for paying its bills as and when it falls due on the day? It looks at that. As Mark will say, cash is king, and it's king here as well. Secondly, historic performance. How much of the business has had its value retained in the business? Very much like when you're trying to save some money. I know it's not easy, but you're trying to save money for a rainy day. If you can put aside a reserve, you're in better shape to weather any sort of the economic turmoil that we're facing. And the same goes for a company as well. Operating profit, that's fairly simple. That's making sure that the money that's coming into the house is more than the money going out of the house. Every economic model works that way if it's going to be sustainable. The value of equity versus the liabilities. And this is a measurement of saying who's really running the show here? Who's got the bigger claim? Do the owners of the business, the shareholders, have the majority claim, or do the creditors, the external funders? control, and have a stake on this business. And also the sales to asset ratio. Dumbed down, this is how good are all those gleaming offices, gleaming shops, and dirty factories? How good are they at making stuff to sell? That's what's envisioned there. And by the way, this model was constructed on the idea that it was annual operating profit and annual sales were going to be measured. And that's in 99% of financial statements. It will be an annual thing. But if you're dealing with quarterly accounts, then you'll have to up the operating profit and the sales. You have to gross it up by 4. If you've got half yearly results, you have to gross it up by 2. So just keep that in mind. In terms of the numbers, now remember I said we've got 3 models really that we're working with here: the public manufacturing, the private manufacturing, and the service company. I'm just going to start with the one that kicked everything off. We're just going to use the public manufacturing as a starter. Those numbers, why is it 1.2, 1.4, 3.3? I'll be honest with you, I'm not going to go through that. That'd be like showing up to a car yard and the salesman says, before we take this for a test drive, I'm going to pull apart the engine. I'm not going to do that. Few reasons for that. One, I'm not a statistician, nor do I pretend to play one on TV. So I'm not going to waste everybody's time with that. Number 2, if the geeks among you want to understand why those numbers are those numbers, there is a plethora of research on the internet, and you can download academic papers and peer-reviewed research to your heart's content, and it will go through the statistical theory that was applied to the model. So I'm not going to waste our time here. And thirdly, this has been in public circulation for over 5 decades, and it's been a reliable benchmark as to whether or not this model can accurately predict a good company or a bad company. And it's proven its worth. Like I said earlier, depending on who's doing the test, it's anywhere from 75, 85. I've even seen some papers saying it's 90% accurate in determining a good company or identifying a bad company. So the way this works is that we apply each of those coefficients to these formulas. So the way it would work is you take the working capital of the business, current assets minus current liabilities, and you divide that by total assets multiplied by 1.2, which is then added to retained earnings divided by total assets multiplied by 1.4, which is then added to operating profit, total assets multiplied. All of this going down until you get a final Z-score. Now, the other thing that really impressed me as I was looking through this is that it's a good diagnostic tool for showing the strengths and the weaknesses of a company. If you've been dealing in credit in any sort of form, sometimes you just get a score. This actually shows you what made up that score and what influenced that score and what influences the underlying risk in this. It's not just computer says no. There is actually some diagnostic in there, and we'll get onto that a little later and showing the application as you are going through this and how you can make a more informed judgment if you are using this within a context of credit analysis. So we get a score, but you've got to know the context of a score. It's like when I got my cholesterol test. He said, "Oh, Brad, your cholesterol's 8.9." I thought, yeah, that's fantastic. And he said, no, that's really bad. We've got to get it down to 3. And then he started talking about exercise and salads, and I just tuned out. But effectively, what we've got here is a range, and you can get a range on these scores. I've seen it going anything from plus or minus 10. That's the sort of scoring that's going to be ending up here. It's not 1 to 100. It's kind of that plus or minus 10 part. But it's really this area of tolerance that we've got to focus on. And again, we're using the public manufacturing model. There are some nuances as we go through the other models, what those numbers are, but we'll just stick to the first one to start with. First of all, anything with a score that ends up greater than 3. So we go through this algorithm, we put all the things together, and we come up with a score that's 3 or greater. What we're saying there is that there's very little chance of any financial distress within that company. You can consider it's akin to saying investment grade or an undoubted credit. That's what's going on there. Anything in the red, again, red not good. And if you're getting a score on this that's less than 1.8, then that company is showing signs of predictable or immediate distress. Something's going to happen to that company and it won't be good. Anything between that area, between the 1.8 and that 3, that's the gray area. So what we're saying there with companies is that they're brilliant, they're not investment grade, but they're not bad. They're not going to fall over, and maybe we should just keep an eye on them when we're doing our credit monitoring. And by the way, I can tell you within, like I said, with my experience, if you're doing credit and credit risk analysis or credit management, you're going to be in the gray. That's where most of your work is going to be. That's going to be the financial and economic profile of your business, of your customers. They're going to be in this gray area. So that's why it deserves a bit of attention. So just moving on, remember I mentioned there were 3 models in play. First of all, the public manufacturing, that's the starting place. And that was developed, like I said, back in the post-World War II boom, where you saw a lot of manufacturing emerging. And the focus there was on publicly listed companies. That was then, the model was then revised by Professor Altman, and it was to accommodate the rise in private manufacturing. Now, if it's private, there's no listed equity, there's no share capital that's listed on a tradable exchange. So private companies had the net equity figure from their balance sheet as sort of swapped in there. And the third model, which was service companies. Now, this was revised to the increase in service economy that was happening certainly in the later part of the 20th century, but now we're very much a service-based economy, moving more to an experience-based economy. And the model then was taken in place. The testing on the statistics showed that the sales to asset variable wasn't as important. And as I was trying to look through, I thought, what's the coherent reason for this? And I came up with this. Within a manufacturer, what's important is how good is the total asset base, both the long-term assets, which your plant, your machinery, your factories, your warehouses, they are the key elements to drive revenue and to drive a successful company. With a service company, you're looking to conclude the transaction within a year. It's a very short-term focus. So if you think about maybe an accounting firm or a firm that gives maybe warranties, or a firm that does repairs, they want to conclude the transaction within probably 30, 60 days. And a lot of work that you're probably looking at are invoices that are 30, 60, 90-day terms. Those are all short term. The service company has to manage the short term and the working capital rather than manage factories. Those are the reasons. Now, we'll just go through and split these down with a little more nuance. Excuse me. So we're still looking at the same 5 elements. As a matter of fact, 5, and you take off one for the service company, like I said earlier, but you're still looking at the same key elements. Those ratios are still the same. The difference between the public and the private companies, they swap out the listed capital, so the share capital that's traded on the exchanges, that gets taken out, and then the shareholders' funds, the total net equity, that's put in its place. But more importantly, the actual coefficients here you can see are changed. And without trying to double back on my comments earlier as to me explaining why these comments, I am going to explain. So explaining these coefficients, I'm going to explain a little about the coefficients. First of all, with public manufacturing, there is a higher expectation from both the shareholders and from the exchange, from the regulators of exchange. So there's higher expectations for them, so therefore the scores are expected to be higher. That expresses a good, medium, or a distressed company. Within a private area, they don't have that supervision. They don't have that scrutiny. So the expectations are lowered a little bit. And certainly when you get into a service company, we've removed the sales to asset ratio because, as I said earlier, there is more emphasis placed upon the management of the short term, the management of the working capital. You can see the difference here between the two. Working capital here is significantly more important in a service company. Operating profits are significantly more important for a service company, and keeping a buffer in place. Because if you think about it, a service company like an accounting firm, a legal firm, a consulting firm of some kind, a retailer, they don't have those big assets. They don't need those big assets to generate something. And even with retail, they can lease their premises and it becomes an operating cost. They don't need to own their premises, they can rent it and that becomes an operating cost. So service companies can need to make sure that they've got tighter control over the working capital and over the performance of the company in terms of the operating profit. You'll also notice that the thresholds have been lowered. There's a lot more volatility within service companies, so therefore that tolerance of volatility is built in. Probably best if I actually just went through and gave a quick example, just so we can see the thing in its natural habitat. So on the screen here, I've got the extracts from a company called Coates PLC. They're a manufacturer and they're listed on the UK FTSE. So as you can see in the top right, we're using the public manufacturing model. And I'm giving you a quick diagnostic of what's going on. So first of all, we can see here that the working capital, we've got it, sorry, let me back up. We're showing this one being in the gray. So it's not a great company, but it's not a bad company. But remember earlier I was talking about the diagnostics. This will show you, and we're just going to walk through this now, what is going on under the covers? Where are the individual risk elements that we are looking at for this company that give it its good and its bad and its ugly? So let's have a look. First of all, the working capital is a little tight, and you can probably do the math here. The working capital as a part of the total balance sheet is relatively thin. That's having a detracting element. Similarly, there's not a whole lot of retained earnings within this company. They haven't actually kept a whole lot there, and probably because this being a listed company, there is an expectation from the shareholders that they'll be receiving a dividend. So the profits have to be paid out to shareholders, part of being listed on an exchange. However, they've got a fairly good profile in terms of market capital. You can see there it's nearly the entire size of the business. And I've seen plenty of companies where the market capital actually exceeds the entire value of the business. And also it's fairly good at using its assets to make things. This makes threads and materials for everything from the shirt on your back, the shoes on your feet, to industrial materials as well. This gives us a total score of 2.3. Now, with anything like this, it's always a good idea to use a commentary on why you've actually used this score and any decision that you made. So, for example, what I'm saying here is that you've reviewed this particular company for a particular period, and the score has come up with 2.3, which is a moderate level of risk. Also, a good idea if you're using this, if you're putting any sort of commentary, if you're going to use this in your risk assessment, that you're saying you're going to note the good and the bad. They've got good market capital. They've got solid asset efficiency. However, the detracting features are the working capital is tight and they haven't retained a whole lot of value in the business. Also, another thing, they're a publicly traded company, so you can monitor through the share price, and you might say, fine, that's supported for standard terms of trade. Hoping everyone's keeping up on that. But again, as Mark said, if there's anything in any shout outs you want to do, let me know and I'll keep an eye on questions for you. We'll take another, and again, that's just my suggestion. Taking another example, let's take a private manufacturing company. Mark, I had to do this one for your home turf, but this is a Tescoma. They make kitchen utensils and they're a privately owned business. So we're using a private manufacturing model. And we can see here, everything's in the green. They're a fairly safe bet, and we can walk through there. The working capital is still fairly tight. And when I say working capital, that's the working capital as a portion of the total value of the business. So that's a little tight there. However, it's retaining good value within the business. And it's also got a very good capital base. You can see there's no market capital to speak of. However, the value of the business is fairly solid. They're really retaining equity within it. And they're using their assets fairly well. So what we can say here is that the review of this particular company for this period, it returned a score of 4.28 using that model. Again, you're noting the good elements being the retained earnings, being the capital base, and being the use of assets, although that's only been now slightly offset by the working capital and supported for terms of trade. Now, the reason I do that, I'll just give you a bit of experience for me. If you're putting anything in there, don't just say it's approved or, computer said 4.82. Get under the skin and show why. This does two things. Number one, the auditors will love you. You've got a good, transparent trail of what you have done. So not only the auditors, but anyone can pick up your work and see exactly why you used this figure, why you used this element, why you came to this part of your decision based upon these elements. And so those two things are very, very important. Always try to keep a trail of what's going on. Now, I suppose the best thing to do now is to have another look at something and see, how good is it at determining the good and the bad. This is Tufnells. Now, anybody in the UK, they might have heard that name. They're a privately owned transport service and logistics company. So we're using the service model up here, and we can see it looks fairly safe. Let's just walk through it again. It's got good working capital. It's got some good retained value in its balance sheet. Operating margins seem fairly robust. And it's got a good equity base as well. Now, remember, service company, we're not using the sales to asset ratio, so that's been omitted. But even with that, the weightings of this model have bumped the score up, and we can see that it's relatively safe. Again, let's just do a quick risk assessment on this. It returned 3.21 at screen, showing a very low level of risk. It's got positive influences from working capital, operating profits, and the capital base, supported for standard terms and trade. That's the suggestion, but not quite. There's something that happened underneath the system, that happened here, that I always recommend people when I'm doing training. There's two things I always say to people when they're looking at financial analysis, and even before you open up the balance sheet and the profit and loss. Two things I always ask. Number one, what does the company do? Not just its SIC code, but what is its business model? What's its customer base? What's its geography? What are its unique selling propositions? So the first thing. And secondly, who owns them? If we go to the holding company, it was a slightly different story. Now, the sales between the trading company and the holding company were roughly the same, but we've got a slightly different story here. Even though the company was trading profitably, the working capital was negative, and that had a profound impact upon indicating whether or not this was a good or bad business. Not only that, it didn't really have a whole lot of capital base. Very, very little capital was retained in the business. And now, if we make a similar assessment on that, we see that the company was distressed, very high level of risk, demonstrated by those elements. And the backstory was, when this company went into administration about halfway through last year, the report was it suffered from a high fixed cost base, which strained the cash flow and the operating margins, and it was placed in administration. It was later bought out. The assets were bought out by a logistics company in the UK called Shift. But it gives you an indication that, one, always check out the full story of the company. Always go to what would be group level accounts and assess it from there, not just the service company, not just the company that you're probably dealing with, but climb the corporate tree, get to find out who's at the top, and then make an assessment. Another element we've got here is that we can see movements from year to year. Now, this is a UK company. I had to change, US company. I had to change some of the details here because of privacy, but it makes for a good demonstration. Dynamics IT, call them a US-based privately held company, and so therefore it's a service company. We're using that model, and as we can see here, the sales have increased. The working capital has decreased. The retained earnings have increased, and the operating margin, while it's still positive, it has shown some drop. And as we can see, if you could just focus on the bottom middle part, we've gone from a green safe score, and using the same model like for like, we've gotten now into the grey. And not only that, we can see what's happened. The working capital's starting to get a bit strange, and their operating margins have been a bit strange. So if you're doing analysis of that, my recommendation would be it's first of all worth maybe having a quick talk to the customer, talk to the company and saying what's going on. Notice your margins come down. Notice your liquidity is looking a bit strained. What's going on? And they can say, yeah, we had a tight year last year. We had to grow, but to increase our growth, we had to offer things at a discounted rate, or you know, a service we had if we wanted market share. So, but you can actually find out what's going. It actually triggers a conversation, and something as a credit analyst, you can be a lot more detailed in breaking down where the risks are within the business and what impact that has to their overall financial state. You could come away from the customer and think, okay, then fine, they're still in good place. But maybe we should just make sure that they're paying us on time. Maybe we should not let them go from slip out from 30 to 45, 50 days. Maybe we should just make sure that we could rein in their collection piece. So those are things to consider. Now, one more thing I'll just quickly touch on here. This took me a bit of work. Is that what do these grades mean in terms of mapping to here, let's say Standard and Poor's, but also Moody's and Fitch? What is this? How does this align to the rating agencies? Now, the irony is, whilst there was quite a lot of research in there, it was fairly fragmented, and no one's really done a fairly comprehensive analysis across all three models. So I did take my cues from Professor Altman. He, in a paper that he published, I think it was in 2017, 2018, he looked back at how this model had been working for the last 50 years. And just to make sure his work was on point. And it still showed that it was fairly accurate in what it was doing. It was still a fairly robust predictor in how good this model was in isolating good and bad companies. And we can see here that the public manufacturing model, the expectations here, so what we're saying here is that, look, if they score within their safe zone, if they score above 3, that's equivalent to saying they're a triple B grade. And that's effectively saying they're investment grade, which goes to show, which kind of sits with probably what you're thinking already. Anything that's B grade or less, certainly within the public market, if you're issuing a B grade debt rating to a company, a publicly listed manufacturing company, that's a bit of a problem. That company you should really be keeping an eye on. That's getting very speculative. If we move it over to a private manufacturer, for example, again, remember when I was saying the expectations are probably a little lower. You don't have the scrutiny of the exchange market. You don't have the scrutiny of the shareholders and of the markets. So the expectations dropped a little bit. What we're saying here is that you can pretty much consider a company that scores of that anything less than 1.23, they're considered a B minus grade. And certainly in my experience, if you're dealing with a credit that's B minus, that's you've got a little bit of scrutiny there. You've got to keep an eye on this thing. With a service company, we can drop the bar even lower. Remember, I said that with service companies, there's a little bit of there's a lot more volatility with those, so you bake those tolerances in. And I'm hoping that looking at that, that makes a bit of sense. As to implementing this, and again, these are all approximates because I had to do some interpolation with some of the gradings there. You can quiz me about that a bit later if you like. In terms of using this, let's say implementing this within your credit policy, how this all works is that a lender is going to consider a few things when they're putting a credit policy together. Their risk appetite, how much footprint do they want on their customers? Do they want to represent a significant customer base or a significant footprint on their customer, or do they want to just have a modest input? What is the size and the sophistication of the credit department? Sometimes, for whatever reason, the credit department is just effectively a tick box exercise. It's fairly modest. And there might be businesses and industries where that's all that's required. I, of course, as a credit professional, say it should be bigger, but there are contexts where there is very limited resources given to the credit department. Also, what are the commercial objectives in terms of the volume targets, the customer base, the geographies? All of these will need to be considered, as well as security as well. If you've got securities like letters of credit, standby letters of credit, bank guarantees, cross-company guarantees, credit insurance, you can be a little more liberal in the amount of credit that you give. But I tried to find out where is a benchmark for what is a credit limit. When you Google something like how do you determine to calculate a credit limit, there's very little out there that's going to give you a formula of how to determine a credit limit. Now, I sat down, I came up with 6 methods to determine a credit limit, depending upon the information you've got, the context of your business, and what sort of credit appetite you've got. But what I did see as a recurring theme, a lot of companies say, as a guidance, giving a credit limit of up to 10% of the net worth. And for safety's sake, you might put a bit of a cap on that as well. You say, right, I'll give 10% of net worth and no credit limit will exceed 2 million euros. It's just an example, just for consideration. That's a fairly ham-fisted way of looking at credit. As we've got a scale that can measure risk, we can also calibrate our risk appetite and our credit limit policy to that. So if you're saying, I've got a safe company here, I'll give them up to 10% of their net worth and cap it up to 5 million in credit. If I'm looking at a company that's within the grey, I'm only going to maybe give 5% of my net worth and up to 2 million of a credit line. And what you see you doing there, you're kind of scaling the amount you're going to be exposed to versus the risk profile of the company. And for anything else, the Altman score can at least give you some resolution of what that looks like. But there's one more element we can add to this.
Brad, can I just jump in a sec? So,
Yes, of course.
yeah, carry it. It's okay. So we've got some belting questions coming through as well. So I think you're, and I'm wrapping them all up and making a note of them. And when we get to the end in a couple of minutes, we'll go through all the questions. And I'm going to ask a few people to expand on what they've been putting in. Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Super. Okay. So reshare.
Oh, you want me? Sorry, I'm continuing. Am I? Sorry. Okay, fine. So looking
You
at
just
these
need to
three,
share again.
I just need to share again. Oh, sorry, reshare. Sorry, that's what he was saying. Reshare. Sorry, my mistake. Okay, thanks very much. Okay, so that's coming up, is it?
Yep. All good.
Great. Okay, thanks very much. So what we can now look at is, because we've got not only the dimension of risk in terms of the Altman score, we can also start putting some further dimension on the sort of credit policies that we want. We're saying with public manufacturing, because of the shareholder scrutiny and the regulator scrutiny, I can take a little more risk on that. With private manufacturing firms, I maybe am not going to be so aggressive. So I'm going to say, right, I'm not going to take 10% of the net worth as a guidance. I'm going to take 8%, and I'm going to cap the credit limits to 8 million. If I get down to the grey, I'm grading that down even further. And when I get to service companies, I see them as maybe a much higher level of risk. So therefore, I'm going to trim my credit appetite even more, capping maybe the most that a company can get up to 5 million. And certainly when they get down to the grey area, down to 2 million. So this starts giving me a little more dimension by using even something simple as the Altman model. I can get a dimension on risk in terms of value, and also a dimension on risk in terms of the business type. So actually using it as part of your credit ecosystem. As I mentioned earlier, and I'm not going to, and Mark and I, we kind of wrestled with this for a little while. If you've got a relationship with a credit agency of any kind, please see them, see what they can do always to help. Always make sure that you've got a solid working relationship with your information providers. But sometimes you don't have that. Sometimes things are a little out of scope. So first of all, if you've got a fairly either immature or a fairly simple credit policy, credit department, this can be some place to start. You've got a fairly robust model that you can at least use to get some assessment on credit and financial risk. It may help if you're branching out in new markets. Now, the example I'd give there, let's just say that 99% of your business is based in the UK and you're using a local credit agency giving you all the information that you need. But then you look at one of your major customers and they've just been purchased by a private conglomerate in Turkey or out of Indonesia. And your credit bureau might not necessarily have scope from that. They could probably do an investigation, but that might take a few days or even a couple of weeks. And you want to make an assessment of it now. What you've got is at least something to give you some idea of what the risk profile is on that company that's in an area where you don't necessarily have expertise or experience. And the third thing is, it's not just credit people who can use this. If you've got your commercial function, and I'm always going to say, please align strongly with your commercial function. Commercial and credit should have a little bit of friction, but there should be a lot more harmony going there. So within your commercial department, it could be used in their systems, maybe, I don't know, embedded in Salesforce, for example, to do some portfolio screening, to do some client screening, or even doing some marketing campaigns. It's always a good idea to have this maybe as a backup, if you like. And at least then you can have some sort of idea of what the risk profile is, even if you've got a fairly mature eco structure in some parts of your credit system in terms of credit scoring. And if you are going to implement it, there's a few things to consider. What financial data systems do you have in place right now? And sometimes using this on a spreadsheet module of some kind is all you need. What technical resources and what training do you have in place? Also making sure what policies you've got to have for not only its implementation, but for its review. Can all the data be reliably collected? And that may come through a credit bureau. It may come through a credit bureau and getting information from your clients. They might have to volunteer it, because I can hear people saying, hey, I work with companies within an SME market, with a small medium enterprise market, and they only have to supply a balance sheet. So you might have to augment that. You might have to ask the customer, what's your trading position look like? Just send it to me in an email. And also how things are going to be validated. All of these considerations, and it's not just for the Z-Score, but any credit automation, any credit scoring you put in place. These are all things you've got to have in mind. So I'll just quickly wrap up in terms of the key parts. First of all, what are the pros of the Altman Z-Score? Well, it's a very well-established model. It's got over 50 years of history with a considerable body of work backing it up both academically and in real-life commercial scenarios. It can effectively identify any distress that you're having in a company. It can isolate and diagnose where the company is falling, either being solid or not, or having some elements of risk. The algorithms, even though they look kind of scary, they're not really. They're fairly easy to use and fairly easy deployment, and it's got a fairly consistent benchmark of risk. The downside, of course, is that it was built fairly a fair amount of time ago. It has had a focus on manufacturing, and I know as we've moved from a manufacturing economy to a service economy, and now we're moving more to an experience economy, there could be criticism to say that this is a little dated, but still effective. You do need all the financial elements. If you are missing, let's say, the sales or the operating profit, it won't work. You've got to have all the elements in place. And as I mentioned earlier, because you have a regulatory environment in a lot of countries where small to medium enterprises only have to file an abbreviated balance sheet, there may be some shortfall here. And also, it does ignore, critics of it, certainly when I've done research, shows that it does ignore maybe some other factors, some market dynamics that may be in play. So I'm just going to pause it there right now, Mark. You said there are some questions,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
I'll try to answer them as much as I can.
Thank you very much. Okay, so welcome everybody. First of all, we said at the beginning we were looking at record numbers, and I think we got to like 147. So thank you so much, really, for that. That's very humbling, and we really appreciate you being here. Some cracking questions were coming through the chat as Brad was doing his presentation, and I think you can see how much research actually went into that presentation. There's an awful lot of work went on over the last couple of weeks to do that. So a big round of applause for Brad for some amazing content and brilliant presentation. The slides are awesome. So we got a few questions that were coming through. And one was something that Patrick Bott said, and it kind of fitted what I was asking. A question I had too was, how does AI and technology actually help to form a score now? Because Patrick was saying he uses the Z-Score as a combination of other things, and there's a lot of other external items of information that can be brought in as well. Patrick, could I put you on the spot? Are you still here? And could you say how do you bring everything together to get to your score?
Yep. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Patrick.
Can everybody hear me?
Oh yes.
Okay, good. So actually, a little bit of a backdrop. I have been familiar with the Altman Z-Score already for, I think, like 10 or 15 years. I got knowledge of this score when visiting a GE-related company, where they used this score, but they also combined this score with other elements that are not included in the Altman Z-Score. And those elements are primarily, of course, your internal data that you also gather on your client portfolio. And the most important ones are payment behavior, but definitely in recent times, also the country risk or sovereign risk is an element that should be included in your overall scoring. So what I did, together with Dun & Bradstreet actually, is combined those scores in coming up with a new rating that follows the Altman Z-Score. So just to give an example, your payment history, if you value this as very important, and of course you can only do this for an existing customer, then you can rate that score to have an influence of like 1 point or half a point when coming to the original Altman Z-Score. Same thing for country risk or sovereign risk, and same thing also for your commercial relationship. If you are having a commercial relationship with a company that lasts for more than 10 years, that should be included in your risk appetite as well. Speaking of risk appetite, the thing that that we need to consider is that the link with your credit limit setting must be in coordinates indeed with your sales colleagues as well. Because if you don't do that, then there is a risk that looking at the Altman Z-Score can give your credit management a little bit of a conservative image.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure if the net worth that is relating to as the percentage of the net worth to take, is that the net worth from the company you are assessing, or is that the net worth from your own company? I think that's a crucial thing to look at. I used the net worth of the company that we were assessing, but I have changed from actually our own risk appetite. How much of our net worth are we willing to invest in a business relationship with this company?
That's great. That was a brilliant reply. Thanks a lot, Patrick. By the way, you just booked yourself a presentation at our conference in October. So I'll be back at you on that one. Thank you. But no, but there's many important points you made there. And one of the things that we talk about and we learn a lot from a training aspect from Callisto is how there's not only is there a disconnect necessarily, or there needs to be a relationship with the salespeople, but in so many shared service centers, the collection teams and the cash allocation teams see the credit scoring aspect of something done by somebody else somewhere else, right? And as you just said, payment habits, which kind of goes through collections and goes through cash allocation, is a critical part of business intelligence. And what we're this whole Altman subject we're talking about today really should show there's a lot more to what we do than just process and transactions. This is a very living, organic. It's not even a process. It's just a fantastic opportunity to really drill into detail of businesses. So thanks very much for that. And going on from what you were saying, that some of the other aspects that I know, like we talk about with Moody's, one of our partners, is a lot of other external aspects that need to be brought into the credit rating as well, like the quality of our customers' cyber security, that maybe even their climate change profiles and so on. These are other things that can perhaps be brought into the overall kind of picture as well. So it's not just financials anymore. There's a lot more to it. But I like what you're saying about the country ratings and adding on plus or minus points for that. That's a very interesting aspect to it.
That's important, Mark. You can, and like Patrick was saying, you can use this. Only looks at the financial elements of the company itself. So it's taking that in isolation, which is great because it means you can place it anywhere. But using that in harmony with your payment experience, with the commercial targets that the company's got, with the credit profile of the where the obligor sits. And you can add weightings to that. You can say, all right, 70% of the decision is going to come from the Altman score, 20% is going to come from payment history, 10% of the weighting is going to come from the country. And again, you do some mathematics to put all that together. It's not that hard, but yeah, great.
And I like that one. I like that one about the loyalty as well. If you've been trading for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, that should have a positive impact on the rating as well. So somebody said I had to drop off a little bit earlier, so they're loving this talk, and awful lot of things I got to go back and consider. There's a lot more to this than just another financial analytic. And I think one of the things that really interests me as well, and we can see right now that there's how AI and machine learning can bring all these different factors together, because we're talking about an awful lot of data, that can change frequently as well. Somebody mentioned on the chat about reviewing these quarterly. David Wilner said that we need to be careful that we're actually analyzing the right numbers as well, which is a critical thing. Where some call it EBIT and some call it operating profit, right? So so make sure that we're actually looking at the right things. Yeah, I think that's a.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and sorry, you can tell I've been in this business for too long, and for me, my head just swaps between the two. But yeah, operating profit is earnings before interest and tax. So and it works out to be the same thing. And I prefer EBIT over EBITDA because EBIT actually has an accounting standard hiding behind it.
I came I think like Patrick said, you came across this like 15 years ago, and I was probably around about the same when I was doing a university course, and it completely changed my view of kind of this part of the business, the credit business. And that when I started sort of playing around with these Altman scores myself, it made it so much more interesting and so much more exciting. And everybody working in any aspect of credit order to cash can do this. You can download any financials and just play around with it, really. In fact, we're going to bring this into our learning program as well very soon, because I think it's a very interesting, exciting aspect. Let's see, what else have we got? Yeah, that was the main one. Do you how do you see the future trends for risk analysis? Is because there's a lot of companies now that don't have assets. If we think about companies like maybe Uber or somebody like that, or a lot of the startup companies, they don't really have assets. They don't have buildings, they don't have cars, they don't have machinery. So do you think there's another phase with Altman that will, or even those that are trading now in cyber currencies and stuff like that, cryptos? Do you think there'll be another level to this kind of analytic?
I think just on that point where you're talking about, the Ubers and so forth, that's a service company. So the Altman model is still fit for purpose. They don't maybe have fixed assets, but they've got current assets. That includes, and even if all that is just some cash in the bank and some receivables, that's still an asset. So the model can still can still cater for that. It can still process it. Again, as long as you've got the total sales or the operating profit. Actually, if it's a service company, all you need is just the operating profit.
Okay, so
it's still workable. And another thing we didn't get onto just quickly, Mark, is that a lot of the credit bureaus, like your DNBs, your Experians, your Moody's, and so forth, within their research, they do still use the Altman as a benchmark to show effectiveness in how good their model is against separating goods and bads. And what I mean by that is, can it correctly produce? Can it make a discernment between a good company and a bad company, and also deal with what we call false positives as well? So it's still very much within the ethos of credit management and credit scoring.
Yeah, and I think, I think that just adds to that makes it really interesting and beyond just a grey process, is that there are so many variables in there. And as you were showing earlier, and I know you were going to have some other examples as well of comparing different kinds of companies and how they changed over time. We're talking here about when's a good time to measure it, quarterly or annually or half yearly and so on. So there's a lot to this. And Dave Wilner made the point that this has got to be looked at over time, because a favorable Z-score 3 or 4 years ago could be an awful lot different now, could have deteriorated a lot. And we see so many companies going out of business or struggling. So I would guess that's the reality.
Yeah, exactly. And that was that little US IT company is what I was demonstrating, going from, let's say, period to period. And that could be year to year or quarter to quarter, as long as you treat the numbers, so that the periods match, so that you annualize if it's quarterly or half yearly. As long as you do that, yes, I would certainly bake this into to that. More so, a lot of the credit scoring you get out of credit agencies, they would only go on, let's say, on the disclosed financials that are, let's say, lodged with the register. If you get information, let's say, direct from the customer that doesn't go through the bureaus, you can still use this as a benchmark, for lack of better words, to see how the credit grade is going. And this is information that is outside of the scope of your credit bureau, but still vital information for you to make sure that you can track it. Because, as you've said, when you get financials that are lodged at a registrar or in the bureau, they're usually 7 or 8 or 9 months old anyway. So yeah.
Okay. Sadly, we're down to the last couple of minutes of our time today. I think we could have safely done another hour of this, and it would have. There's so much more that we could have shared. The recording will be in our membership section for anybody who wants to who would like to see it. But also, I'd like to just say, please follow us follow Callisto on LinkedIn, because there'll be more of these. We're back in a month for our next session, around about a month from today, for our next coffee club. But mainly, I'd like to say again, thank you to Brad for I know you put an awful lot of work into this, so really can't thank you enough. We've been talking about it, since before Christmas? So a couple of months pulling this together. So if I could get everybody to give you a round of applause, I would right now, right? So because it's been brilliant. Thank you so much for that. Also, mainly, thank you to everybody who joined us today. I know I've said it a couple of times, but to have almost 150 people for a webinar on a Wednesday morning. I know a lot of you have come from other places where it's still very early in the morning, so we really do appreciate it. So okay, we'll be, like I said, we're back in a month. So there'll be lots of information about our conference and various other things. So please stay in touch in the meantime. We look forward to hearing from you. I think we will do a poll on this, as was suggested. Otherwise, take care, stay safe, God bless, and we'll see you all very soon. Thank you, and all the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mark. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.